Hey,
So what we're
Professor,
going to
so
do now is
much.
we're going to talk about yet another type of method category that's provided with completable futures. And this is going to be something called the arbitrary-arity methods, which is kind of a funny name. And you'll see in a second why we call them arbitrary-arity methods. And what arbitrary-arity methods do is they're used to process completable futures in bulk. And you can see there's a very small number of them. In fact, there's only 2 of them. So these arbitrary-arity methods return a completable future. Each one of them returns a completable future. And that completable future is triggered after the completion of either any or all of the completable futures that are passed as parameters to these arbitrary-arity methods. And arity, as I mentioned before, is just a fancy name for the number of parameters that you pass to a method or a function. So you have unary methods that take 1 parameter. You take binary methods that take 2 parameters, trinary methods, and so on, quaternary methods. And arbitrary-arity methods just mean you can take an arbitrary number of parameters. The 2 arbitrary-arity methods that are part of the completable futures framework are all of, which takes a var-args parameter, which means it can be arbitrary number of parameters. And it returns a completable future to void, which is kind of wacky. And it returns a completable future that completes when all the completable futures in the var-args parameter have finished. And then there's also something called any of, which also takes an arbitrary number of parameters as a var-arg, returns a completable future to void. And that completable future that it returns will complete when any completable future in the variable number of parameters completes. So all of is basically everything. Any of is whichever one finishes first. And what you typically do here is you return, or you make a call to any of or all of, and you get back this completable future. And then you can use that to wait reactively on any or all of the n completable futures that were passed in as a var-arg parameter for them to complete. So this allows us to have a single point of waiting for things to wrap up, which is very powerful and useful. Now, usually we don't wait by blocking, but instead we use some other form of completion stage method, something like then apply, usually then compose sometimes, but usually we would use then apply in conjunction with the result that comes back from any of or all of. And this fits into the reactive programming model that we've talked about before by making programs more responsive by not blocking caller code. So the caller doesn't block the code that is doing the call can get back a completable future, and then it can do other things while that set of arbitrary parameters is off doing other computations that are running in the background in the common fork join pool, of course, or some other pool of threads. We're going to focus here for the discussions on the all of arbitrary-arity method. And it basically performs a bit like the then combine completion stage method that we talked about earlier on steroids. So then combine allows you to essentially be triggered when 2 previous stages complete. So it's kind of this logical and operation, whereas all of lets you be triggered when an arbitrary number of completable futures complete. So that's why I said it's like then combine on steroids. It's puffed up and dripping with power and flexibility. Now, for a variety of reasons, these arbitrary-arity methods are rather hard to program directly. And the main reason why they're hard to program directly is because they return a completable future to void, which is very weird. And so what we're going to do is we're going to encapsulate them. And we're going to encapsulate them with a wrapper. We're going to talk about that wrapper here shortly. And this will then be much easier to program. And in fact, it makes it very simple to integrate this with the Java Streams framework, as we do in your programming assignment. So that's the end of the overview of arbitrary-arity methods. As we'll see, they're difficult to use directly, so we're going to encapsulate them. And not only will that make them easier to use, but it also makes them real easy to integrate with the Java Streams framework, which we're going to talk about more in just a moment.